Other therapists may have their own definition, their own understanding of the difference between a slip and a relapse. For me, a slip is a one-time occurrence. It's something that is not premeditated. It's something that basically the sex addict is not prepared for, or they have let their recovery fall off and presented with a situation that they ended up going into that forbidden behavior, whatever the behavior is, whatever they have defined for themselves to say, these are behaviors that I will not do, and if I do them, then I've slipped or relapsed. Now, a relapse is something that happens more than once, or it's something that's been premeditated. For example, someone whose spouse is going to be out of town week after next, and the sexual addict thinks, I know what I'm going to do when the spouse is gone. So the spouse goes out of town and they have been looking forward to acting out. Then they act out, and it doesn't matter how brief the acting out experience may be. It may be a few seconds. For example, you mentioned someone going out of town. They are in a hotel room, they turn on an X-rated movie and watch for a few seconds and say, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Shut it down. And they may say, well, that was a slip. No, they premeditated it. They looked forward to it, they planned it, and the fact that it only happened for a few seconds says that was a relapse.
Well, it sounds like that a slip can be something that's unpremeditated and happens pretty quickly, and that a relapse, even if it's a small or short event, still took a lot of planning and time. So there's a lot more time involved in a relapse than there is in a slip.
More time, or it ends up happening again. For example, let's do a scenario staying with the person in a hotel room looking at an X-rated video on the television. Maybe they're just flipping through the television. This is not premeditated. They're unwinding after a long day at work, working out of town, working with clients, and flip through and suddenly see something that is X-rated, it's pornographic. They look at it for a few seconds. If they had turned it off immediately, it would have been something that was unintentional, and I don't believe would have qualified even as being a slip. But to stay with it for several seconds and continue watching it, at that point it's a slip. But they say, okay, that's enough. I'm going to get out of it and won't go back. Maybe the behavior has only taken about 10 seconds. Now, if they go back to it tomorrow night for a few seconds, at that point, it's a relapse because the behavior's been repeated. The interesting thing is, it's not the type of behavior that determines whether it's a slip or whether it's a relapse. A slip or a relapse can involve something like pornography. A slip and a relapse may also involve people. Just to give an example of that, a businessman that was out of town, had way too much to drink, and that was also an indicator to him. That was something he had already decided that he should not do when he's out of town, to drink alone, because he knew that his sexual behavior and his drinking were closely intertwined.
We all know alcohol disinhibits the brain.
Absolutely. And he said after dinner, going up to his room, ended up going up the stairs the same time a coworker did, and ended up ended up, as though it just happened. Right. Ended up in a sexual encounter on the stairway. Caught himself, stopped, said, what am I doing? Got out of it, and I truly think it's a slip. Now, because that person was married, that slip did have much more devastating consequences to the spouse than if, say, he had been looking at pornography in his hotel room. If that person, instead of stopping the behavior at that point, had said, well, I've already messed up, I might as well just spend the night with this person. At that point, that's not a slip. That's a relapse, because more time is involved.
Right.
This particular individual did not have a travel plan. They hadn't planned what they were going to do when they were out of town. If they had a travel plan, that probably would have included talking to their sponsor, doing some work back in their hotel room, maybe attending a meeting when they're out of town, or going to a telephone meeting 12-step meeting I'm talking about.
So it sounds like it'd be pretty hard not to have a slip or a relapse at some point.
For many people, slips and relapse are a part of their recovery process, but I don't believe they are inevitable. When sex addicts go to meetings, they will often hear other people in meetings say, well, I was sober for 6 months or maybe 6 years and I had a slip. Well, again, the slips don't just come out of the woodwork. They just don't appear.
It's important for the addict to realize that they have options and choices and they're not doomed to have a slip or a relapse.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they need to change that expectation, and instead of expecting to slip, to expect themselves to remain sober. Now, that doesn't mean that they will be living perfectly in recovery or doing recovery perfectly. It does mean that they can live the rest of their lives without having a slip or a relapse.